The Nile still rose and fell with ancient reliability, flooding the black earth and withdrawing again to leave grain shimmering under a white sun. But by the time Cleopatra was born, the rhythms that had sustained Egypt for millennia no longer governed its fate. Alexandria glittered at the coast, marble facades catching the light, harbors dense with sails and foreign tongues, yet beneath the polish lay fatigue. Egypt was wealthy, but its wealth was increasingly mortgaged. It was learned, but its learning had become ornamental rather than commanding. Power now flowed westward, toward Rome, and Egypt's survival depended not on armies or gods, but on negotiation, debt, and restraint exercised under pressure. The Ptolemaic dynasty had never been Egyptian in origin. Descended from Macedonian generals who carved up Alexander's empire, its rulers governed as Greeks in language, culture, and instinct. For nearly 3 centuries, they had balanced on a narrow ledge, ruling a deeply Egyptian population while projecting Hellenistic legitimacy to the wider Mediterranean. Early Ptolemies had been formidable, patrons of learning, builders of fleets, masters of grain supply. But dynasties age like men. By Cleopatra's era, the line had thinned into something brittle, its authority sustained more by habit than force. Succession disputes were common, assassinations routine, and legitimacy often decided not by lineage alone, but by Roman arbitration. Rome's presence was felt everywhere, even where its banners did not fly. Roman merchants crowded Alexandria's docks. Roman creditors held Egypt's debts. Roman generals determined who ruled client kingdoms from Asia Minor to Judea. Egypt, once an exporter of influence, had become an exporter of grain and cash, feeding Rome's swelling urban population in exchange for precarious autonomy. The arrangement was understood by all parties. Egypt remained independent so long as it was useful and compliant. Any deviation invited intervention, justified as stabilization, protection, or debt collection. The eastern Mediterranean of Cleopatra's youth was not a landscape of sudden conquest, but of slow absorption. Rome did not rush to annex Egypt outright, in part because the prize was too valuable to mishandle. Whoever controlled Egypt's grain controlled Rome's streets. For decades, Roman leaders preferred Egypt weak but intact, governed by monarchs too divided to resist but too entrenched to provoke revolt. This policy encouraged dysfunction. The Ptolemaic court became a place where survival depended less on reform than on managing rivalries, bribing officials, and anticipating Roman moods. Inside Egypt, the strain was visible. The countryside remained productive, but taxation grew heavier as royal coffers emptied into Roman hands. Native Egyptian priests, once partners in governance, were sidelined by Greek administrators who neither spoke the language nor understood the rituals binding temple to village. Alexandria itself, cosmopolitan and volatile, was prone to riots sparked by ethnic tension, grain shortages, or perceived insults from the throne. The city was loyal only when fed and entertained, dangerous when ignored. Cleopatra entered this world not as a savior figure, but as a royal child born into expectation and risk. She was one among many offspring produced to secure succession, alliances, or simply continuity. Her father, Ptolemy XII, ruled uneasily, his reign marked by exile and restoration through Roman support purchased at ruinous cost. When Roman troops returned him to the throne, it was clear to all that Egypt's sovereignty existed at Roman discretion. Cleopatra grew up knowing that kingship was conditional and that Rome was the ultimate audience for every decision made in Alexandria. Education at the Ptolemaic court was rigorous, but it was also strategic. Cleopatra was trained not only in rhetoric and philosophy, but in observation. She learned how power presented itself and how it concealed weakness. She absorbed the languages of those Egypt depended upon and those Egypt ruled. Unlike many of her predecessors, she paid attention to the land beyond the palace walls, to the symbolic weight of tradition, to the ways legitimacy could be felt as much as declared. These were not romantic inclinations, but survival mechanisms shaped by the environment she inhabited. The decline of Ptolemaic authority was not dramatic in a single moment. It was cumulative, expressed in compromises that could not be undone. Each appeal to Rome solved an immediate crisis while tightening the long-term bind. Each internal rivalry weakened the dynasty's ability to speak with one voice. Cleopatra's world was one where no decision was isolated. Alliances created obligations, debts created leverage, and weakness invited supervision disguised as friendship. By the time Cleopatra was old enough to understand the mechanics of rule, Egypt was already living on borrowed time. Roman politics had grown more volatile, driven by ambitious men whose private armies and personal fortunes eclipsed the authority of the Senate. Civil war loomed repeatedly, and Egypt's resources made it an irresistible factor in Roman struggles. Neutrality was no longer safe. To survive, Egypt would need to choose carefully whom to support and when, knowing that every choice carried consequences beyond its borders. Cleopatra's inheritance, then, was not simply a throne, but a dilemma. She would rule a kingdom rich in memory, but poor in leverage, admired for its antiquity, yet dismissed as decadent, essential to Rome, yet never trusted by it. The environment that shaped her was one of constant calculation, where identity itself became a tool. To be Greek was to speak to Rome in familiar terms. To be Egyptian was to command loyalty at home. To fail at either was to invite collapse. There was no single moment when Egypt fell under Rome's shadow. It had been standing there for generations, lengthening with every Roman victory, every loan, every intervention framed as assistance. Cleopatra's world opens not with crisis, but with constraint. The empire she would later confront was already present in her childhood, embedded in treaties, debts, and expectations. Understanding this reality is essential, because Cleopatra's defiance, when it came, was not born of arrogance or impulse. It was forged in a world where the margin for error had narrowed to almost nothing, and where survival demanded not resistance alone, but mastery of the forces that threatened to erase her kingdom entirely. Cleopatra's childhood unfolded behind walls designed as much for containment as for splendor. The palace quarter of Alexandria, sprawling along the eastern harbor, was a city within a city, guarded, insulated, and thick with ritual. Courtyards echoed with footsteps of servants and guards. Corridors carried whispers in multiple languages, and every movement was observed by someone whose loyalty could not be assumed. From an early age, Cleopatra learned that proximity to power did not guarantee safety. In the Ptolemaic court, it often meant the opposite. Dynastic instability was not an abstract condition, but a daily reality. Succession among the Ptolemies followed no firm principle beyond survival. Brothers married sisters to preserve legitimacy, then murdered or exiled them when alliances shifted. Mothers ruled as regents, then vanished from records when sons came of age. Poisonings were rumored, imprisonments routine, and executions conducted with a bureaucratic efficiency that stripped them of drama, but not fear. Cleopatra grew up knowing the family tree as a record of eliminations as much as inheritances. Kinship offered access to power, but also marked one as expendable. Her father's reign reinforced these lessons. Ptolemy XII was weak by temperament and circumstance, dependent on Roman backing and distrusted by his own subjects. His absences during exile created power vacuums that filled quickly with rivals and opportunists. When he returned, escorted by Roman forces, the message to his children was unmistakable. Legitimacy could be restored, but only at a price paid in obedience and gold. Cleopatra witnessed how authority could be lost and reclaimed, and how little sentiment accompanied either outcome. Education, in this environment, was not merely cultivation but preparation. Cleopatra's tutors instructed her in philosophy, rhetoric, mathematics, and history, but the most valuable lessons were observational. She learned how her father's advisors spoke differently in private than in public, how decrees were crafted to satisfy Roman expectations while placating Egyptian priests, how silence could be safer than protest. She understood early that intelligence was not simply knowledge, but timing, and that restraint could be as powerful as assertion. Language was central to this education. The Ptolemaic court conducted its business in Greek, but Cleopatra made a deliberate effort to go beyond it. She learned Egyptian, an unusual choice for a dynasty that had long ruled without speaking the language of the majority. She absorbed Latin sufficiently to follow Roman discussions without intermediaries. She listened to Aramaic, Hebrew, and other tongues common in Alexandria streets. This multilingualism was not an affectation. It was a way of reducing distance, of hearing intention without filtration, of understanding how different communities framed power and obligation. Luxury surrounded her, but it did not soften the edges of her upbringing. Fine clothing, trained musicians, and ceremonial processions existed alongside locked doors, guarded chambers, and the knowledge that removal from favor could be swift and final. Cleopatra's position as a daughter, rather than a designated heir, gave her no guaranteed path forward. She had to assume that survival would depend on usefulness. That assumption sharpened her attention. She watched how alliances formed and dissolved, how public favor could be manipulated, how memory itself could be shaped by official narrative. The norms of violence that governed succession were not hidden from her. Public executions served as warnings, while private disappearances left space for speculation that was often worse than certainty. Cleopatra learned that fear was not only a tool wielded by rulers, but a condition endured by them. Even at the apex of power, no one was secure. This understanding bred caution rather than paralysis. She did not romanticize strength. She recognized it as temporary, contingent, and always contested. Psychologically, this environment fostered a particular kind of ambition. Cleopatra did not aspire simply to rule. She aspired to endure. Her sense of self was shaped by the constant possibility of removal, and this sharpened her awareness of consequence. Decisions mattered not only for their immediate effect, but for how they reposition her within the web of relationships that defined the court. She learned to read hesitation, to note who spoke first and who waited, who avoided eye contact and who lingered. These details were not trivial. They were signals. Alexandria itself reinforced these lessons. The city was vibrant but volatile, its population divided by ethnicity, class, and allegiance. Riots could erupt with little warning, often triggered by shortages or perceived slights. Cleopatra observed how the palace responded, sometimes with concessions, sometimes with force, always mindful of Roman reaction. The city taught her that authority required visibility and that neglect carried risks. It also showed her how symbols mattered, how processions, coinage, and public appearances could stabilize or inflame sentiment. Religion added another layer. The Ptolemaic rulers styled themselves as pharaohs to Egyptian subjects, adopting ancient iconography and temple rituals. Cleopatra paid attention to this dual identity. She understood that religion was not simply belief, but infrastructure, binding communities through shared practice. Observing priests and festivals, she grasped how legitimacy could be reinforced through continuity with the past, even when political reality had shifted. This insight would later become one of her most effective tools, but it was formed early through quiet attention rather than instruction. By adolescence, Cleopatra had internalized the court's logic. Trust was provisional, alliances reversible, and power always borrowed from somewhere else. Yet she also recognized what set her apart. Her education was broader, her linguistic range wider, her attentiveness sharper. She did not mistake these traits for immunity. Instead, they became means of navigation. She learned when to speak and when to withhold, when to display competence and when to appear deferential. These were not performances layered over her character, but adaptations carved into it. Cleopatra's early life was not a prelude to destiny, but an apprenticeship in constraint. The palace taught her that survival required flexibility without surrender and confidence without display. Violence was normalized, but it was not glorified. It was a fact to be managed. By the time she approached adulthood, Cleopatra had already absorbed the central lesson of her world, that power was never static, and that those who survived longest were those who understood its fragility best. The Ptolemaic system Cleopatra inherited was less a coherent state than an accumulation of compromises layered over time. It had been designed for conquest and extraction, not longevity, and its longevity was owed more to Egypt's natural abundance than to institutional resilience. At its core was a Greek ruling elite governing from Alexandria, culturally and administratively distinct from the vast Egyptian population that sustained the kingdom through agriculture, labor, and religious continuity. This separation had once been manageable, even advantageous, but by the 1st century BCE, it had hardened into a liability that eroded authority from within. The ruling class spoke Greek, educated their children in Greek traditions, and framed their legitimacy through Hellenistic kingship. Law courts, taxation offices, and military commands operated in Greek, creating an administrative barrier that excluded most Egyptians from meaningful participation. In earlier generations, the dynasty had compensated for this divide through careful engagement with Egyptian religious institutions, presenting the king as pharaoh in temples, even while ruling as Basilius in the palace. Over time, however, this balance deteriorated. Fiscal pressure increased, respect diminished, and ritual became performance rather than partnership. The result was a population that complied out of necessity rather than loyalty. Economically, Egypt remained formidable. The Nile's annual flood ensured reliable harvests, and grain exports were the backbone of Mediterranean food security. Royal monopolies controlled papyrus, oil, textiles, and mining operations. On paper, Egypt was one of the richest kingdoms in the known world. In practice, much of that wealth flowed outward. Roman creditors claimed interest on loans extended to stabilize Ptolemaic successions. Roman merchants dominated trade networks. Roman politicians treated Egypt's treasury as a resource to be tapped through negotiation or threat. Wealth existed, but control over it was increasingly compromised. Debt was the most effective instrument of this control. Ptolemaic rulers borrowed heavily to secure Roman support during succession crises or periods of unrest. These loans were not neutral financial tools. They carried political expectations. Failure to comply could invite arbitration, and arbitration often arrived backed by legions. Rome rarely needed to conquer Egypt directly because its leverage was already embedded in contracts and obligations. The appearance of sovereignty was maintained, but the terms were dictated elsewhere. Internally, the dynasty's decay was visible in its governance. Offices were sold rather than earned. Corruption tolerated so long as revenue continued to flow, and military forces neglected because Roman protection was assumed. Native revolts flared periodically in Upper Egypt, suppressed with enough force to restore order but not enough reform to address causes. Each suppression further alienated the population and reinforced the perception that the monarchy existed above, rather than within, Egyptian society. Alexandria, the seat of power, embodied these contradictions. It was intellectually vibrant, home to scholars, engineers, and physicians whose reputations stretched across the Mediterranean. It was also politically unstable, prone to factional violence and civic unrest. Greek, Egyptian, Jewish, and other communities lived in proximity, but not cohesion, each with distinct privileges and grievances. The Ptolemaic administration managed this volatility through grain distribution and spectacle, methods effective in the short term but brittle under sustained pressure. When shortages occurred, resentment turned quickly toward the palace. Rome watched all of this closely. The Senate and later individual Roman power brokers had no interest in strengthening Egypt's institutions. A stable, independent Egypt could challenge Roman dominance in the eastern Mediterranean. A weak Egypt, divided internally and dependent externally, posed no such risk. Roman arbitration in dynastic disputes became routine, setting precedents that normalized intervention. Each time Rome decided who would rule Egypt, the principle of self-determination eroded further. The Ptolemaic military reflected this decline. Once capable of projecting power beyond Egypt's borders, it had become a defensive force supplemented by mercenaries whose loyalty followed payment rather than crown. Greek settlers formed the backbone of the army, but their numbers dwindled and their commitment waned as prospects diminished. Egyptian soldiers were used, but rarely trusted with command. This imbalance reinforced ethnic divisions and limited the army's effectiveness as a unifying institution. Legitimacy, therefore, existed in fragments. To Egyptian priests, the king remained pharaoh so long as temples were endowed and rituals observed. To Greek elites, legitimacy rested on dynastic continuity and cultural familiarity. To Rome, legitimacy was transactional, granted to those who complied with Roman interests. The Ptolemaic ruler had to satisfy all three audiences simultaneously, often with conflicting demands. Failure with any one could destabilize the entire system. Cleopatra came of age within this structure, understanding that the system itself constrained what any ruler could achieve. Reform threatened entrenched interests and risked Roman suspicion. Inaction allowed decay to continue unchecked. The dynasty's past decisions narrowed future options, creating a situation where even intelligent, capable leadership faced structural limits. Egypt's sovereignty was not lost in a single act of conquest, but diluted through dependence, precedent, and accommodation. The illusion of independence was carefully maintained. Coins bore royal images, decrees were issued in the king's name, and foreign envoys treated the court with ceremonial respect. Yet the decisive questions, who would rule, how debts would be repaid, which alliances were permissible, were increasingly answered beyond Egypt's borders. Sovereignty became a matter of form rather than substance, preserved because it was useful to Rome, not because it was secure. Understanding this system is essential to understanding Cleopatra's later actions. She did not inherit a failing state out of ignorance or excess, but one already constrained by long-term structural decay. Egypt's wealth masked its vulnerability, and tradition concealed its dependence. Cleopatra's challenge was not merely to rule, but to navigate a system designed to keep her kingdom subordinate. The Ptolemaic order she inhabited was already approaching its limits, and every choice she would make unfolded within boundaries set long before she reached the throne. Cleopatra's accession did not arrive with triumph, but with procedural inevitability, the fulfillment of what was shaped as much by Roman expectation as by dynastic custom. When her father died, the throne passed not to a single ruler, but to a pair, Cleopatra and her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII. The arrangement followed Ptolemaic precedent, which framed sibling co-rulership as a stabilizing mechanism, binding legitimacy through shared blood while preventing any single figure from consolidating too much power too quickly. In practice, it almost always produced rivalry. Authority in Alexandria had become too fragile and too coveted to be shared without friction. Cleopatra was around 18 when she assumed the title of queen. Her brother was a child, perhaps 10 or 11, surrounded by regents and advisors who understood that proximity to a malleable king offered opportunity. From the beginning, the co-rulership was unequal in experience but equal in legal standing, a tension that invited manipulation. Cleopatra possessed education, political awareness, and a sense of the system's weaknesses. Ptolemy XIII possessed the throne's symbolic value and the backing of men who had built their careers navigating palace intrigue. The balance was unstable by design. The court around them was not a neutral administrative body, but a contested space shaped by factional loyalty. Advisors aligned themselves not to the crown as an institution, but to individuals whose favor promised survival. Cleopatra's inclination toward independent rule, her visible intelligence, and her refusal to recede quietly into ceremonial obscurity made her a threat to those who had thrived under pliant monarchs. Her brother's guardians, particularly the eunuch Pothinus and the general Achilles, recognized that Cleopatra's presence disrupted the familiar patterns of control. Removing her did not require open rebellion. Only procedural pressure applied at the right moments. Cleopatra attempted, at first, to assert authority through established channels. She issued decrees in her own name, appeared on coinage without her brother, and emphasized continuity with her father's reign while subtly reshaping its tone. These were not acts of defiance, but signals meant to communicate competence and legitimacy to both domestic and foreign audiences. Yet in a system where authority was already diluted, such signals were easily framed as overreach. Each assertion hardened opposition among those who interpreted strength as a threat rather than reassurance. Alexandria's volatility amplified the tension. The city's population watched the palace closely, sensitive to any sign of instability that might affect grain distribution or civic order. Rumors circulated quickly, often encouraged by those who benefited from uncertainty. Cleopatra's efforts to govern were interpreted through lenses shaped by factional interest. To some, she represented renewal and competence. To others, she was an obstacle to influence. The absence of a unified administrative culture meant that perception often mattered more than policy. Rome's shadow hovered over these developments, even when Roman officials were not physically present. The terms of Ptolemaic Egypt's restoration were still fresh, and the memory of Roman arbitration in succession disputes loomed large. Cleopatra understood that legitimacy could not be secured in Alexandria alone. It required Roman acknowledgement, or at least Roman acquiescence. Her rivals understood this as well, and they moved to frame her actions as destabilizing, hoping to position themselves as the safer alternative should Rome intervene. The break came not as a dramatic coup, but as a gradual narrowing of options. Cleopatra found access to resources restricted, her allies sidelined, her decrees challenged or ignored. The mechanisms of governance, already weak, were turned against her. Co-rulership became a pretext for paralysis, with decisions stalled or reversed under the guise of protecting the young king's interests. In reality, it was a method of isolating the queen. Authority slipped not through defeat, but through attrition. Exile followed with a kind of quiet efficiency. Cleopatra was forced out of Alexandria and away from the institutional center of power. There was no formal trial, no public denunciation that might provoke unrest. Instead, she was rendered irrelevant within the capital, pushed to the margins where her claim could be more easily dismissed. This outcome reflected not a lack of resolve on her part, but the effectiveness of entrenched factions operating within a system designed to absorb and neutralize threats without overt violence. Outside Alexandria, Cleopatra confronted the limits of royal identity stripped of infrastructure. The title of queen meant little without access to treasury, army, or administrative machinery. Yet exile also offered clarity. Removed from the immediate pressure of court intrigue, she could assess the situation without illusion. The forces arrayed against her were not merely personal rivals, but structural realities, a dynasty hollowed out by dependence, an elite invested in weakness, and a foreign power whose interests shaped every internal dispute. Cleopatra did not disappear into passivity. She began to gather support, drawing on remaining loyalists, and seeking alliances beyond Egypt's borders. This was not rebellion in the conventional sense, but an attempt to reinsert herself into the political equation by altering its terms. Her understanding of Roman influence sharpened. If legitimacy was mediated through Rome, then survival required engagement on that level. Exile transformed from punishment into preparation. The episode revealed how fragile authority in Egypt had become. A reigning queen could be displaced without open conflict, not because she lacked will or intelligence, but because the system no longer supported decisive leadership. Power resided in networks rather than offices, in relationships rather than laws. Cleopatra's removal demonstrated that sovereignty was conditional even within the palace, subject to manipulation by those who controlled access and narrative. This first confrontation with structural reality reshaped Cleopatra's approach. It confirmed what her upbringing had suggested, that strength alone was insufficient without leverage, and that legitimacy required recognition from forces beyond Egypt's borders. Her exile was not an endpoint, but a diagnostic moment. Exposing the anatomy of decline, she would spend the rest of her reign attempting to counter. When Cleopatra left Alexandria, she carried with her more than a claim to the throne. She carried a refined understanding of the system she was up against. The co-rulership had failed not because it was mishandled, but because it was incompatible with the political environment it was meant to stabilize. Authority had become too fragmented, too conditional to sustain shared rule. Cleopatra's future actions would reflect this lesson, shaped by the knowledge that survival now depended on mastering the forces that had expelled her, rather than resisting them directly. Rome did not arrive in Egypt as an empire fully formed, confident and unified. It arrived fractured, exhausted by internal conflict, and carrying its instability outward in the form of generals, debts, and armed solutions to political problems it could no longer contain at home. By the time Roman power intersected decisively with Cleopatra's struggle, the Republic was already unraveling. Egypt's fate became entangled not because Rome was strong and deliberate, but because it was volatile, and volatility seeks resources, legitimacy, and leverage wherever they can be found. For decades, Roman politics had been driven less by institutions than by individuals. The Senate still convened, laws were still passed, but real power increasingly followed military command and personal loyalty. Ambitious men raised armies not for the state, but for themselves, financing campaigns through conquest and promising veterans land and spoils. Civil war became cyclical, a condition rather than an exception. Each conflict ended not with resolution, but with temporary dominance, leaving grievances unresolved and rivals intact. Julius Caesar emerged from this environment, not as an inevitable ruler, but as a product of its failures. His rise depended on alliances that were transactional and fragile, most notably the partnership with Pompey the Great and Crassus. When that arrangement collapsed, Rome slid into open war. Caesar's crossing of the Rubicon was not merely an act of defiance, but an acknowledgement that the Republic no longer possessed mechanisms capable of containing its own leaders. From that moment, Roman politics became inseparable from Roman arms. Pompey's defeat at Pharsalus did not end the conflict. It displaced it. The losing side fled eastward, carrying Roman civil war into territories that had long existed under Rome's influence but outside its direct control. Egypt, wealthy, strategically vital, and politically divided, became an obvious refuge. Pompey's decision to seek asylum there was shaped by precedent. Egypt had supported Roman leaders before, mediated disputes, and provided resources when it suited its interests. Yet the Egypt Pompey approached was not the stable ally of earlier generations. It was a kingdom already destabilized by factional struggle and dependent on Roman approval. The arrival of Pompey's representatives placed the Ptolemaic court in an impossible position. Supporting Pompey risked Caesar's retaliation. Rejecting him risked appearing disloyal to Rome's established order. The decision made to murder Pompey upon his arrival was not born of cruelty but calculation, an attempt by Ptolemy Xi's advisors to align decisively with the presumed victor. It was a brutal misjudgment. In killing Pompey, they demonstrated subservience rather than strength, and they underestimated how Caesar would interpret the act. When Caesar arrived in Alexandria shortly afterward, he came not as a conqueror, but as a pursuer, carrying the unresolved business of Roman civil war into Egypt's capital. His presence immediately altered the balance of power. Rome's internal conflict had now physically entered the Ptolemaic system, and with it came Roman expectations of authority. Caesar did not see Egypt as a neutral kingdom making sovereign choices. He saw it as a client state whose actions required justification, especially when those actions involved the execution of a Roman consul. Caesar's initial demands reflected this mindset. He sought repayment of debts owed by Ptolemy XII, asserting financial claims as political leverage. He insisted on arbitration between Cleopatra and her brother, framing Roman intervention as legal mediation rather than intrusion. These demands were not extraordinary by Roman standards, but they revealed how thoroughly Egyptian sovereignty had been redefined. Rome no longer needed to annex Egypt to control it. The right to arbitrate its internal disputes was enough. Alexandria reacted with tension and uncertainty. Caesar's small force was sufficient to assert presence but not dominance, making his position precarious. The city's population was restless, aware that Roman involvement could destabilize grain supplies and provoke violence. Ptolemaic Egypt's faction oscillated between compliance and resistance, attempting to assert authority without provoking Roman reprisal. In this atmosphere, Cleopatra recognized both danger and opportunity. Rome's fracture created openings as well as threats. Caesar was powerful, but he was also isolated, dependent on local conditions and political outcomes beyond his control. Cleopatra's decision to engage Caesar directly was shaped by this understanding. She did not approach Rome as an abstract entity, but as a collection of individuals whose fortunes were uncertain. Caesar's authority rested on momentum, reputation, and the promise of future stability, none of which were guaranteed. Cleopatra understood that if Egypt's fate was to be decided within Roman power struggles, then she needed to become a participant rather than an object. This was not submission, but adaptation to a reality already imposed. The subsequent conflict in Alexandria, often framed as a localized war, was in fact an extension of Roman civil strife. Roman soldiers fought alongside and against Egyptian forces, not over ideology, but over control of decision-making. The burning of ships in the harbor, the fighting in city streets, and the siege conditions that followed underscored how deeply Egypt had been drawn into Rome's internal collapse. The city that had once mediated Mediterranean exchange now hosted a confrontation born entirely of Roman instability. Throughout this period, the distinction between Roman and Egyptian interests blurred. Decisions made in Alexandria had implications for Rome, and decisions made in Rome reverberated through Egypt. Sovereignty became inseparable from alignment. Cleopatra's survival depended not on asserting independence in the traditional sense, but on navigating Rome's fractures with precision. Supporting the wrong Roman leader could be fatal. Supporting the right one could restore her position, but at the cost of deeper entanglement. Julius Caesar did not come to Egypt intending to end the Ptolemaic dynasty, nor to elevate Cleopatra out of admiration or ideology. His actions were pragmatic, shaped by immediate needs, securing grain supply, stabilizing the region, and neutralizing threats while Roman politics remained unresolved. Cleopatra's advantage lay in recognizing this pragmatism and meeting it with equal clarity. She did not mistake Caesar for an embodiment of Rome's will. He was one contender in a struggle whose outcome was still uncertain. Rome, in this chapter of Egypt's history, appears not as a single will, but as a storm system, unpredictable and forceful, reshaping everything it touched without a unified direction. Its civil wars exported violence, uncertainty, and opportunity in equal measure. Egypt, once peripheral to Roman internal affairs, was now embedded within them. Cleopatra's reign unfolded within this context, where sovereignty was no longer defined by borders or titles, but by one's ability to survive the shifting alignments of a republic in collapse. By the time Caesar's presence was established in Alexandria, the old distinctions had dissolved. Egypt was no longer merely influenced by Rome. It was structurally bound to Rome's internal conflicts. Cleopatra's future would be determined not by isolation from Roman power, but by her capacity to operate within its fractures. Rome entered her story not as an external invader, but as the environment itself, unstable, dominant, and impossible to ignore. Cleopatra's return to Alexandria did not resemble a restoration in the traditional sense. There were no triumphal processions announcing the return of a rightful monarch, no sweeping gestures meant to reassure a unified populace. Instead, it unfolded within a city strained by siege, uncertainty, and the presence of a Roman general whose authority rested on circumstance rather than permanence. Cleopatra came back not as a figure rescued by fortune, but as one who had calculated the limits of her situation and chosen the only available path that preserved agency. Her re-entry into power was inseparable from Julius Caesar's presence. By aligning herself with him, Cleopatra did not escape Egypt's structural dependence on Rome. She acknowledged it and sought to shape it. The alliance was grounded in mutual necessity. Caesar required stability in Egypt to secure grain shipments, repay debts, and prevent the Eastern Mediterranean from becoming a theater of renewed opposition. Cleopatra required Roman recognition to neutralize her brother's faction and reclaim access to the machinery of rule. Neither could achieve these aims alone. The popular retellings of their meeting obscure its underlying logic. Cleopatra did not approach Caesar as a supplicant driven by desperation, nor did Caesar elevate her out of fascination. Their interaction was deliberate, shaped by constraint. Cleopatra understood that Caesar's authority in Alexandria was real but fragile. He commanded a limited force, isolated in a hostile city, dependent on alliances to maintain control. This vulnerability created leverage. By presenting herself as a stabilizing partner rather than a rival claimant, Cleopatra offered Caesar something he needed immediately: a coherent alternative to the chaos of co-rulership and factional violence. For Caesar, supporting Cleopatra offered clarity. The co-rule between Cleopatra and Ptolemy XIII had failed not because of personal incompatibility, but because it mirrored the systemic dysfunction of the Ptolemaic state. Backing a single ruler simplified governance and aligned with Rome's preference for identifiable clients. Cleopatra's intelligence, political awareness, and willingness to engage directly with Roman authority distinguished her from the advisors surrounding her brother, whose actions had already demonstrated poor judgment. Caesar's decision was pragmatic, not sentimental. The conflict that followed within Alexandria underscored the costs of this alignment. Fighting broke out between Roman forces and those loyal to Ptolemy XIII, turning the city into a contested landscape. Streets that had once carried merchants and scholars became battlegrounds. Supplies tightened, tensions flared, and the civilian population bore the weight of decisions made at the top. Cleopatra's position during this period was precarious. Her restoration depended on a Roman victory that was not guaranteed, and failure would likely mean permanent removal rather than renewed exile. When Ptolemy XIII died during the fighting, the path cleared abruptly, though not cleanly. His death did not resolve Egypt's deeper instability, but it eliminated the immediate rival around whom opposition had coalesced. Cleopatra was reinstated as queen, formally paired with another younger brother in accordance with dynastic custom, though real power now rested firmly with her. The arrangement satisfied tradition while conceding reality. Cleopatra ruled, but she ruled within a framework reshaped by Roman intervention. Her alliance with Caesar extended beyond military outcome. It redefined Egypt's position within the Roman world. Cleopatra did not resist Rome's growing influence. She integrated Egypt into it on terms she could manage. She presented herself not as an obstacle to Roman interests, but as their most reliable guarantor. Grain shipments resumed, debts were addressed, and the appearance of stability was restored. In exchange, Egypt's autonomy narrowed further. Decisions of consequence now required consideration of Roman reaction, and Cleopatra understood this constraint as the cost of survival. Cleopatra's agency in this period lay not in denying dependence, but in directing it. She leveraged her relationship with Caesar to secure internal authority, marginalize hostile factions, and reassert control over administration and revenue. Her presence alongside him was political, reinforcing her legitimacy in Roman eyes, while signaling to Egyptian elites that resistance was futile. This was statecraft conducted through proximity rather than proclamation, influence rather than decree. The personal dimension of their alliance, while real, was secondary to its political function. Cleopatra was acutely aware that Roman leaders were transient, their fortunes subject to sudden reversal. Caesar's dominance, though formidable, was not permanent. Aligning with him required preparing for the possibility of his fall. Cleopatra did not mistake intimacy for security. Instead, she treated it as one instrument among many, useful while conditions allowed and replaceable when they did not. Alexandria itself reflected the consequences of this shift. The city settled into an uneasy calm, its population wary but compliant. Roman presence remained visible, a reminder that order was externally enforced. Cleopatra's court adjusted accordingly. Administrative decisions became more cautious, public displays more calculated. The queen projected continuity with Egypt's past while acknowledging the realities of its present. She appeared in Egyptian religious contexts, reinforcing traditional legitimacy, even as Roman oversight defined the boundaries of her authority. Cleopatra's restoration marked a transition from reactive survival to deliberate strategy. Exile had taught her that resistance without leverage was futile. Her return demonstrated that leverage could be constructed through alignment, even when that alignment carried long-term risks. She accepted those risks because the alternatives were worse: marginalization, fragmentation, and eventual annexation without negotiation. The alliance with Caesar did not resolve Egypt's vulnerability, it managed it. Cleopatra secured her throne, but she did so by binding Egypt's fate more closely to Rome's internal struggles. This was not a failure of imagination, but an acknowledgement of historical causality. The Mediterranean world of the 1st century BCE did not permit isolation for a kingdom as strategically vital as Egypt. Cleopatra's achievement was not independence, but relevance, positioning Egypt as indispensable within Roman calculations rather than expendable. In this sense, her return to Alexandria was not a victory over Rome, but a recalibration of Egypt's role within a Roman-dominated system. Cleopatra emerged not as a defiant monarch standing apart from empire, but as a ruler who understood that survival required participation in forces larger than her own state. Her alliance with Caesar restored her authority while narrowing her options, a trade she accepted with clear eyes. The chapter closes not with resolution, but with a new equilibrium. Cleopatra ruled again, her throne secured for the moment, her authority recognized by Rome's most powerful figure. Yet the price of that recognition was lasting entanglement. Egypt's future was now inseparable from Roman politics, and Cleopatra's agency would be measured not by how fully she escaped that reality, but by how skillfully she navigated it. Caesar's death shattered the logic that had sustained Cleopatra's position, not because it removed a protector, but because it exposed how provisional every protection had been. The equilibrium forged in Alexandria had depended on a single Roman figure whose authority, though contested, had imposed coherence on chaos. When he was assassinated in Rome, cut down not by foreign enemies, but by senators who claimed to defend a collapsing republic, the violence reverberated far beyond the forum. For Cleopatra, the news did not arrive as tragedy or shock, so much as confirmation. The Roman world she had tied Egypt to was not stabilizing. It was accelerating towards something harsher. In the immediate aftermath, Egypt did not plunge into crisis. Grain still flowed, administration continued, and Cleopatra remained firmly on the throne. On the surface, stability seemed to hold. Yet this calm was deceptive. Caesar had functioned as a guarantor not because Roman institutions were strong, but because his personal dominance suppressed rival claims. With him gone, there was no agreed center of gravity. Rome fractured again, this time with fewer restraints and greater militarization. Power was no longer something to be negotiated patiently. It was seized and defended by force. Cleopatra understood that Caesar's death altered the nature of legitimacy itself. Under Caesar, alignment with a single dominant figure had provided clarity. Now legitimacy was fragmented, claimed simultaneously by multiple Roman actors, each demanding recognition and resources. The Senate asserted authority it could no longer enforce. Caesar's heirs and lieutenants mobilized armies in his name. Old alliances dissolved as quickly as they formed. replaced by expedient coalitions that lasted only as long as advantage required. For a client kingdom like Egypt, this environment was far more dangerous than open hostility. Egypt's strategic value increased as Roman instability deepened. Grain shipments were no longer just economic assets. They were political weapons. Whoever controlled Egypt's supply could influence Rome's urban population and, by extension, its power struggles. Cleopatra's position, therefore, attracted scrutiny from every faction. Neutrality was impossible, but commitment was risky. Supporting the wrong claimant could invite retaliation. Delaying commitment could be interpreted as defiance. The space for cautious maneuvering narrowed sharply. Cleopatra's previous strategy, effective under Caesar, required adjustment. Personal alignment with a single Roman leader was no longer sufficient, because no leader could guarantee longevity. Instead, Rome had become a shifting field of armed competitors whose authority rested on soldiers' loyalty rather than legal sanction. Cleopatra faced a dilemma with no clean solution. Egypt needed Roman favor, but Rome no longer spoke with one voice. Each engagement carried the potential to entangle Egypt in conflicts it could not control. Internally, the consequences were subtle but corrosive. Egyptian elites, already accustomed to Roman influence, became more cautious and more self-interested. Court factions recalibrated their loyalties, speculating about which Roman power might ultimately prevail. The memory of Caesar's intervention had demonstrated how quickly internal disputes could invite external force. Cleopatra maintained order, but order now depended less on consensus than on anticipation. Decisions were shaped by forecasts rather than policy goals, by risk management rather than reform. The military dimension reinforced this insecurity. Roman forces in the eastern Mediterranean shifted allegiances, regrouped, and moved unpredictably. Egypt's own army, limited in size and capability, was not a deterrent. Cleopatra knew that any serious confrontation with Rome would be catastrophic. Her leverage lay not in resistance, but in utility. Egypt had to remain indispensable without appearing threatening, supportive without surrendering control entirely. This balance became harder to sustain as Roman politics brutalized. Caesar's death also altered the symbolic framework of power. He had embodied the transition from republic to personal rule, even as he denied the title of king. His assassination suggested that no authority was safe from sudden violence. For Cleopatra, this reinforced the lesson that Roman leaders were mortal not only in body, but in position. Attachment to any one figure carried inherent risk. Yet disengagement was not an option. Egypt's sovereignty, already theoretical, became even more contingent on external recognition enforced by arms. The Roman leaders who emerged in Caesar's absence were less inclined toward mediation and more toward domination. Legitimacy was increasingly demonstrated through victory rather than consensus. This shift reduced the value of diplomacy and increased the cost of miscalculation. Cleopatra's earlier success had depended on reading Roman personalities accurately and aligning Egypt with a stabilizing force. Now there was no stabilizing force, only momentum generated by competing ambitions. Despite this, Cleopatra did not retreat into isolation. She continued to present Egypt as orderly, prosperous, and reliable, reinforcing the image of a kingdom worth preserving rather than dismantling. Religious rituals proceeded, administrative continuity was emphasized, and public disorder was minimized. These measures were defensive, intended to prevent Rome from finding pretext for direct intervention. Stability became a performance aimed as much at Roman observers as at Egyptian subjects. Yet beneath this surface, Egypt's position was more precarious than before. Caesar's patronage had provided a degree of insulation, however fragile. Without it, Cleopatra stood exposed to a Roman system that rewarded aggression and punished hesitation. Every decision carried amplified consequence. The margin for error had narrowed to almost nothing. Temporary stability masked long-term vulnerability. Psychologically, Cleopatra faced a different kind of pressure than during her exile or restoration. Then, Danger had been immediate and visible. Now it was diffuse, embedded in rumors, troop movements, and political alignments unfolding far from Alexandria. Anticipating threats became as important as responding to them. Cleopatra's restraint during this period was not passivity, but calculation, a recognition that premature action could be fatal. Rome's instability did not weaken its grip on Egypt, it tightened it. As Roman leaders competed, they drew more heavily on Egypt's resources, expecting compliance as proof of loyalty. Each concession bound Egypt further, while refusal risked reprisal. Cleopatra's challenge was no longer how to regain power, but how to prevent Egypt from being consumed by conflicts it had not created. The death of Caesar thus marked a turning point not toward liberation, but toward deeper entanglement. The equilibrium he had imposed collapsed, revealing a Roman world more violent and less predictable than before. Egypt's apparent stability concealed a worsening reality. Sovereignty increasingly enforced by Roman arms, legitimacy granted temporarily and withdrawn abruptly, and survival dependent on navigating a landscape where force had overtaken law. Cleopatra remained on her throne, but the conditions of her rule had changed. The alliance that had restored her was gone, replaced by a system that demanded constant reassessment and offered no guarantees. Egypt was not stronger for having survived Caesar. It was more exposed. The coming years would test whether Cleopatra's adaptability, honed in exile and restoration, could withstand a Roman world where power no longer paused long enough for equilibrium to take hold. Mark Antony entered Cleopatra's world not as a savior or conqueror, but as a symptom of Rome's transformation. He represented the eastern face of Roman power at a moment when the Republic had effectively fractured into competing zones of control, each governed by military authority rather than civic consensus. For Cleopatra, Antony's rise offered both a renewed opening and a familiar danger. He was an opportunity because he wielded legitimate power backed by armies. He was a risk because that power rested on unstable political ground, shaped by ambition, rivalry, and the constant threat of reversal. After Caesar's death, Rome reorganized itself through expedience. The Second Triumvirate formalized what violence had already made clear. Rome would be governed by men with armies. Antony emerged as one of its central figures, assigned control over the eastern provinces. This sphere was vast, wealthy, and restless, encompassing territories long accustomed to semi-autonomy under Roman oversight. It required a leader capable of extracting resources, maintaining order, and preparing for inevitable conflict with rivals in the West. Antony understood the military demands of this role, but he also understood its financial realities. Armies required payment, loyalty required reward, and Egypt remained the single greatest reservoir of liquid wealth in the eastern Mediterranean. Cleopatra recognized this immediately. Antony's authority was not abstract. It was logistical. Without reliable resources, his position would weaken. Egypt's grain, treasury, and strategic location made it indispensable to his ambitions. Yet Cleopatra also understood that Antony, like Caesar before him, did not embody Rome as a stable institution. He was one actor among several. His legitimacy derived from force and agreement rather than tradition. Aligning with him could secure Egypt's position temporarily, but also risked binding Egypt to another transient Roman trajectory. The Eastern Roman world Antony inherited was unstable but malleable. Client kings ruled at Roman pleasure. Local elites navigated shifting allegiances, and Roman governors exercised authority unevenly. Unlike the West, where power gravitated toward Rome itself, the East operated through negotiation and spectacle as much as coercion. Antony leaned into this dynamic, presenting himself as a Hellenistic-style ruler, receptive to local customs and alliances. This posture made him approachable to Cleopatra in a way that earlier Roman officials had not been. He did not expect submission framed as humiliation. He expected collaboration framed as loyalty. Cleopatra approached Antony with a clarity forged by experience. She no longer entertained illusions about restoring full independence. Her objective was narrower and more realistic: to preserve Egypt's internal autonomy by embedding it within Roman power structures in a way that minimized interference. Alignment, not resistance, remained her strategy. But alignment had to be managed carefully. Antony's ambitions extended beyond governance. He sought legitimacy equal to his rivals, and that legitimacy required success in the East. Cleopatra understood that she could offer him resources and stability in exchange for political security. Their engagement unfolded as a negotiation rather than a surrender. Cleopatra presented Egypt as orderly, prosperous, and indispensable, reinforcing the image she had cultivated since Caesar's death. Antony, in turn, recognized that Egypt under Cleopatra functioned efficiently, without the constant revolts or administrative chaos that plagued other client states. Supporting her rule served his interests. It ensured continuity of supply and projected competence in his domain. This mutual recognition formed the basis of their alliance. Yet the risks were evident from the beginning. Antony's position within Rome was contested, and his Eastern focus exposed him to accusations of excess and foreign influence. Cleopatra was aware that visibility could become liability. Her presence alongside Antony strengthened their alliance, but also sharpened Roman suspicion. The line between partnership and provocation was thin. Cleopatra had to balance asserting Egypt's value without appearing to dominate or distract Antony from Roman priorities. Psychologically, this phase demanded a different kind of discipline. Cleopatra was no longer reclaiming power. She was maintaining it under scrutiny. Every gesture carried symbolic weight. Excess could be interpreted as decadence, restraint as weakness. Antony's temperament, more volatile than Caesar's, added uncertainty. He was capable, charismatic, and impulsive, driven by loyalty and honor as much as calculation. Cleopatra understood that managing such a partner required attentiveness and adaptability, not control. Egypt's internal stability during this period was real but conditional. The economy functioned, temples were funded, and administration remained centralized. Yet the knowledge that Egypt's security depended on Roman favor was pervasive. Elites understood that their fortunes were tied not only to Cleopatra, but to Antony's success. This awareness produced compliance, but it also fostered anxiety. Cleopatra governed a kingdom that appeared secure while standing on external foundations that could shift suddenly. Antony's eastern campaigns and preparations for confrontation with rivals further complicated matters. His need for resources intensified, drawing more heavily on Egypt's capacity. Cleopatra weighed each concession carefully. Providing support strengthened the alliance, but deepened dependence. Withholding support risked alienation. There was no neutral ground. Cleopatra chose engagement, believing that influence required presence and that absence would invite intervention without negotiation. The broader Roman context reinforced her calculation. As Roman politics grew more polarized, moderation lost value. Success was measured by dominance. Cleopatra could not insulate Egypt from this reality. She could only navigate within it. Aligning with Antony was not an endorsement of his vision, but an acknowledgement that he controlled the Eastern Roman apparatus that defined Egypt's external environment. This alignment also reflected Cleopatra's evolving understanding of autonomy. Independence no longer meant isolation or self-sufficiency. It meant preserving decision-making capacity within constraints imposed by stronger powers. By embedding Egypt within Antony's Eastern strategy, Cleopatra sought to shape outcomes rather than merely endure them. This was a limited form of agency, but it was agency nonetheless. The chapter of Antony's emergence thus marks a continuation rather than a departure. Cleopatra did not abandon her earlier strategy. She refined it. Experience had taught her that Rome's instability was permanent, not transitional. Survival depended on identifying where authority concentrated at any given moment and positioning Egypt accordingly. Antony represented the next concentration of that authority, imperfect and impermanent, but unavoidable. Opportunity and risk were inseparable. Antony offered protection and recognition, but he also drew Egypt deeper into Rome's internal conflicts. Cleopatra accepted this tension because the alternatives were worse. Resistance invited destruction. Withdrawal invited marginalization. Alignment offered at least the possibility of influence. As Antony consolidated his eastern power, Cleopatra's fate and Egypt's future became bound to his. This was not a romantic entanglement, but a strategic convergence shaped by necessity. Cleopatra sought to secure Egypt's autonomy not by defying Roman authority, but by attaching Egypt to it in ways that made disruption costly. Whether this calculation would hold depended not on intention, but on the outcome of Roman struggles far beyond Egypt's borders. As Cleopatra and Antony consolidated their authority in the eastern Mediterranean, the balance they sought to maintain began to generate consequences beyond their control. What had functioned initially as a practical alignment, grounded in logistics and mutual necessity, increasingly took on symbolic weight within Rome's fractured political culture. Egypt's stability, once an asset quietly appreciated by Roman power brokers, became conspicuous. Visibility replaced utility, and in a Roman world where legitimacy was contested through narrative as much as force, visibility carried danger. Antony's eastern domain grew more cohesive under his command. Client kingdoms were reorganized, military preparations intensified, and revenue streams were redirected toward sustaining armies loyal to him personally. From a strategic perspective, the arrangement made sense. The eastern provinces were wealthy, but required firm coordination to be effective. Cleopatra's Egypt, efficiently governed and financially solvent, sat at the center of this system. Grain shipments, silver reserves, and logistical support flowed reliably. Yet what appeared as competence from Alexandria appeared as excess from Rome. Roman political culture had long been suspicious of the East. Wealth, luxury, and monarchy were associated with moral decay in the Roman imagination, a contrast to the austere virtues Rome claimed as its foundation. Antony's prolonged presence in the eastern Mediterranean, coupled with his reliance on Egypt, fed these anxieties. Cleopatra's prominence within his sphere amplified them. Her role, pragmatic and administrative in reality, was reframed through Roman rhetoric as undue influence. Egypt's visibility transformed it from a partner into a symbol. Cleopatra understood this shift, even as its momentum proved difficult to slow. Her earlier strategy had relied on remaining indispensable without attracting hostility. Under Antony, that balance eroded. Egypt's contributions were too substantial to hide, and Antony's willingness to foreground his eastern base of power made concealment impossible. Decisions made in Alexandria now echoed loudly in Rome, interpreted through factional agendas that sought to undermine Antony's legitimacy by association. Rome's internal divisions sharpened accordingly. Rival leaders framed the struggle not merely as a contest between individuals, but as a moral conflict between Roman tradition and foreign corruption. Egypt became a rhetorical weapon. Cleopatra's monarchy, her court, and even her cultural identity were deployed as evidence that Antony had abandoned Roman values. This framing was not accidental. It simplified complex political realities into narratives that could mobilize support and justify confrontation. For Cleopatra, the danger lay in losing control of how Egypt was perceived. Her authority within Egypt remained firm, but perception abroad now shaped the kingdom's security. Roman audiences did not see administrative efficiency or strategic necessity. They saw a concentration of wealth and power outside Rome's direct control. Egypt's indispensability, once its shield, became a provocation. The more essential Egypt appeared to Antony's position, the more attractive it became as a target for his rivals. This shift constrained Cleopatra's options further. Reducing Egypt's visibility risked weakening Antony's logistical base, undermining the alliance that protected her throne. Maintaining support deepened Rome's suspicion and hardened opposition. Cleopatra found herself managing not only policy, but symbolism, a far more volatile domain. Every gift, every public appearance, every decision regarding territory or title carried amplified, meaning once filtered through Roman politics. Antony's own actions exacerbated the situation. His approach to governance in the East, influenced by Hellenistic models of kingship, contrasted sharply with Roman expectations. Ceremonial displays, redistribution of territories, and public acknowledgement of Cleopatra's status reinforced perceptions of a parallel power structure. While these actions strengthened his position locally, they provided his enemies with material to question his loyalty to Rome. Cleopatra could not fully control this dynamic. Her partnership with Antony bound her to his choices as much as to his fortunes. Within Egypt, the consequences were less visible but no less real. Elites who had adapted to Roman dependence now faced uncertainty about which Roman authority would ultimately prevail. Loyalty became cautious, investments conservative. Cleopatra maintained order, but the awareness that Egypt's fate was increasingly entangled in a narrative war beyond its borders introduced new anxiety. Stability required constant reaffirmation, not only through administration, but through restraint. Cleopatra's own posture adjusted accordingly. She remained present but measured, avoiding unnecessary provocation while sustaining the alliance's practical foundations. This restraint was often invisible to Roman observers, who encountered only fragments shaped by hostile interpretation. Cleopatra could not correct these narratives directly. She had no voice in Rome's assemblies, no control over its rumors. Influence operated indirectly, through outcomes rather than arguments. The growing polarization in Rome left little space for nuance. As factions prepared for inevitable conflict, alignment itself became a liability. Cleopatra's Egypt was no longer judged solely on its actions, but on its associations. Neutrality, already impractical, became impossible. Egypt's role in sustaining Antony's eastern power placed it squarely within the line of fire. Cleopatra's earlier hope that indispensability would deter aggression proved optimistic in a climate where domination mattered more than stability. The paradox deepened. Egypt's effective governance, once a model of reliability, now appeared threatening precisely because it worked. Rome's rivals did not want Egypt destabilized. They wanted it controlled. Cleopatra's success at preserving internal order made Egypt an attractive prize rather than a peripheral concern. The question in Rome shifted from whether Egypt mattered to who would command it. Psychologically, this period demanded sustained composure. Cleopatra was no longer reacting to immediate crises, but managing an accumulating risk that could not be resolved through decisive action. Patience became a discipline rather than a choice. She continued to govern as though continuity were assured, understanding that visible panic or retrenchment would only invite intervention. Her restraint was strategic, an attempt to deny Rome justification for direct involvement while preserving leverage through utility. Yet the structural trend was unmistakable. As Cleopatra and Antony consolidated the East, Rome's internal divisions hardened into opposition defined by identity as much as policy. Egypt's visibility within this struggle became a liability because it symbolized an alternative center of power. Cleopatra had sought to secure autonomy by embedding Egypt within Roman authority. Now that embedding made Egypt inseparable from Rome's most volatile conflicts. The partnership that had restored Cleopatra's security began to generate the conditions of future vulnerability. Antony's consolidation required Egypt's support. That support made Egypt central to Roman rivalry. Cleopatra found herself once again navigating a narrowing corridor, where each step forward increased exposure. The difference this time was scale. The stakes were no longer confined to Alexandria or the eastern provinces. They encompassed the future structure of Roman power itself. As Rome's divisions sharpened, the possibility of compromise receded. Outcomes would be decided by force, not arbitration. Cleopatra understood that when that moment arrived, Egypt's visibility would not protect it. It would mark it. The challenge ahead was no longer how to remain indispensable, but how to survive being indispensable in a world preparing for war. Octavian's ascent altered the nature of the conflict in ways Cleopatra could neither fully predict nor directly counter. Where previous Roman rivalries had been fluid, defined by shifting alliances and pragmatic calculations, Octavian imposed a sharper frame. He did not merely compete for power. He redefined what power meant. In doing so, he transformed Cleopatra's position from that of strategic partner within Roman politics into a symbolic enemy against which a new Roman identity could be asserted. Octavian's strength did not initially lie in military brilliance or personal charisma comparable to Caesar or Antony. It lay in discipline, patience, and an acute understanding of Roman political psychology. He recognized that Rome's exhaustion with civil war had created a hunger not just for victory, but for moral clarity. Endless contests between generals had eroded faith in the Republic's institutions. Octavian responded by offering a narrative rather than a personality. Rome under threat, Rome betrayed, Rome in need of restoration. This narrative required an antagonist capable of embodying everything Rome feared it was becoming. Cleopatra fit this role with unsettling precision.